All right, we are going to go ahead and talk about protists. So we have been talking about eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. Remember, eukaryotic cells are way more complex than prokaryotic cells, and prokaryotic cells are things like bacteria. They only make up unicellular organisms, so be aware of that. Remember, eukaryotic cells are much more complex. They have little compartments called organelles, and those organelles are what do all of the jobs within that cell. And we, as humans, and a part of the animal kingdom, we are made of eukaryotic cells. Plants are made of eukaryotic cells. Fungi is made up of eukaryotic cells. And so now we're going to talk about this branch of organisms called protists. And protists are eukaryotes, so they are made up of eukaryotic cells. Okay, we're made up of eukaryotic cells. Let's see if I can get out of the way. That cannot be classified as plants, animals, or fungi because for some reason they don't have all of the correct anatomy or processes that make them plants, animals, or fungi. They are a member of the kingdom Protista, and we haven't talked about kingdoms yet, but the way that biologists classify organisms, the way we organize organisms. The kingdom of Protista is extremely diverse. They have very little traits in common. And we basically can branch them out into 3 different categories. And they can either be animal-like protists, plant-like protists, or fungi-like protists in how they function. So the structure. So protist cells are eukaryotic, but are much simpler than those found in plants, animals, or fungal cells. So they are eukaryotic cells, but they're a lot more simple. So they have less structures or less complex structures, but they still have those organelles, those same organelles that we talked about, like the Golgi body and the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, protists can either be unicellular, so the entire organism is only made up of one cell, or multicellular, meaning the entire organism is made up of many cells. We talked about those 2 words, but I just want to reiterate what they mean. So protists can either be unicellular or they can be multicellular. They have to get food. We talked about that. We have to get energy from somewhere, so they have to somehow get food. And protists can either produce their own food or can eat other organisms for food. Now this means that they can be either heterotrophs or they can be autotrophs. Okay? An autotroph is an organism that makes their own food. They're also known as producers because they produce all the food that's eventually going to get eaten all the way up the food chain. And they do this using their chloroplasts. Remember, those were only found in plants, so plants must be producers and they must be autotrophs. Okay, they do this using chloroplasts and the sun to do a process called photosynthesis. That's turning the sun's energy into chemical energy. These are a couple of examples of autotrophs. This is Spirogyro, which you'll actually get to see hopefully this Friday. And then we have, I'm not really sure what this one is, but another autotrophic. You can see all the little green dots, those are chloroplasts within that protist. And then we have heterotrophs. So autotrophs make their own food. Heterotrophs can't make their own food, and they have to eat other organisms for energy, kind of like us. They have to find something, and then they have to eat it, and then they have to digest it, and then they get the energy. So heterotrophic protists eat things like bacteria. So remember, those are prokaryotic. Eat things like bacteria and yeast and other smaller protists. Now, when you're a heterotroph, when you eat other organisms, you can fall into either of these 3 categories. You can be a decomposer. That means you get energy from eating dead things. You can be a consumer. That means you eat energy by eating living organisms or things that you've killed right away to eat. Or they can be a parasite. This is an organism that gets its energy from invading another organism and feeding off of its nutrients. The organism it invades is called its host. So we, as humans, we eat other organisms just after killing them, and we are considered a consumer. We do not eat dead things that are rotting, and we don't attach onto any living things and basically harvest the nutrients off of them. So these are a couple of examples. This is, I believe, a plasmodium, and I'm not sure again what this one is, but this is you'll see it swimming around and stuff. It's going to eat off the Spirogyra. Can't remember what the name of it is though. All right, reproduction. So protists, like all living things, have to reproduce. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about bacteria, and they're going to reproduce in very similar ways because they tend to be smaller. The type of reproduction can either be genetic, always used. So if your parents do asexual reproduction, you will do asexual reproduction, and your kids will do asexual reproduction, and their kids will do asexual reproduction. It can either be genetic or it can depend on environmental conditions. Basically, if there's a lot of other organisms just like you around, you will share your genetic information and do sexual reproduction. Whereas if there's not a lot, then the protists may do asexual reproduction, where there's just one parent. And if you remember, asexual reproduction means just one parent, and that means that one cell is going to have to split into two cells. Remember the word binary fission, and we'll look at a diagram of that in a second. Or you can do sexual reproduction. That means there are two parents, and these two parents exchange genetic information or share genetic information and then produce four genetically different cells than the parent cells. So this is called conjugation, and we talked about both of these two when we talked about bacteria, and protists actually use very similar ways of reproduction. So this is asexual reproduction. This is binary fission, where we have one cell, it makes a copy of its genetics, and then it splits into two so that you have two identical daughter cells, or two identical cells that each have the identical copy of genetics. And then we have conjugation, and this one's a little more complex, where you have one cell and it has some sort of genetic material, and it shares it with another cell. Okay, it doesn't have it right here, but it's going to share it. See, it's traveling into the other cell. Okay, traveling in, and now they both have new genetic information, right? This guy had it only before, and now this guy and this guy have it, and now they are ready to split. So now this organism can split into two and make two daughter cells, and this organism can split into two and make two daughter cells. And so now the organisms are different. The daughter organisms, these two are going to be genetically different than these two were. And so you have unique individuals, which helps them better adapt to their environment. We talked a little bit about that. So, all right, that's protists. Thank you.